Tonight, we drift back into the shadowed corridors of the Middle Ages, a world where candlelight flickered against cold stone walls, and secrets were whispered in cloisters, castles, and taverns alike. We often picture the medieval world as knights in shining armor, monks bent over manuscripts, and peasants tilling the fields, but just beneath that surface lay a far darker reality. Hidden truths, forbidden practices, and mysteries that for centuries remained locked away in silence. In this journey, we will gently peel back the layers of time to uncover the unsettling secrets that history almost forgot. So, settle in, let the world outside grow quiet, and allow me to guide you through the hidden shadows of the Middle Ages. Part 1. The Forbidden Truths of Ancient Rome. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to Rome. Not the Instagram-ready version with polished marble ruins and tourist buses, but the actual city. Dusty, crowded, noisy, and filled with far more scandal than philosophy. Rome, for all its grandeur, was less about noble speeches and gleaming temples, and more about who could gossip, poison, or outmaneuver their relatives without getting stabbed in the Senate. So let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and wander into the parts of Rome that were not carved into triumphal arches. These are the little truths that Romans themselves tended to keep quiet, or at least whisper about while refilling their wine cups. Let's begin with family life, which in Rome was less nurturing home, and more political chessboard with occasional infants. A Roman father, the paterfamilias, technically owned his children, his wife, and occasionally even his grandchildren. In the same way, he owned the household's chickens. It sounds like an exaggeration, but Roman law was refreshingly blunt about this. A father could sell his son into slavery 3 separate times before the state even raised an eyebrow. The message seemed to be, we all make mistakes, Marcus. Just try not to overdo it. Marriage was also less about love and more about strategic alliances, which is why most Roman noble families could have taught modern hedge funds a thing or two about mergers. Daughters were particularly useful in this arrangement. A girl might be married off at 12, which even by ancient standards was eyebrow-raising. The men, meanwhile, often preferred to marry later, in their late 20s or 30s, which created some deeply unsettling household dynamics. Imagine a weary senator in his mid-30s paired off with a 12-year-old who had just learned how to embroider. The age gap wasn't seen as odd, it was simply called Tuesday. And once you were married, fidelity was optional. For men, that is. Roman wives were expected to keep themselves pristine and virtuous, while men were largely free to indulge in affairs, mistresses, and whatever happened after their 3rd goblet of wine at a banquet. As long as a man wasn't sleeping with another man's respectable wife, it was usually fine. Brothels, slaves, and actors were considered fair game. Romans treated actors with about as much respect as a modern reality TV star, which did not stop senators from slipping into their dressing rooms. Of course, this double standard occasionally backfired, particularly when the wives of powerful men decided they'd had enough of embroidery and obedience. Enter Messalina, the infamous wife of Emperor Claudius. She was around 20 years old when she married the emperor, who was in his 50s, half paralyzed and widely regarded as an absent-minded academic. Naturally, Messalina looked for entertainment elsewhere. According to Roman sources who, admittedly, never missed a chance to exaggerate, Messalina went on a spree that would put a modern celebrity scandal to shame. One story claims she entered into a competition with a prostitute to see who could sleep with more men in a single night. Messalina, being ambitious, apparently won with a score of 25. Whether that's true or just Roman slander, we'll never know, but it does capture the general Roman view of her. Another report says she secretly married her lover, Gaius Silius, while still married to Claudius, as if divorce was simply too boring. When Claudius finally noticed he had her executed, the moral lesson, Never underestimate what your spouse might be doing when you're stuck reading Senate paperwork. Then there was Caligula, Claudius's nephew, who demonstrated what happens when you give a young man too much power, too much money, and far too few therapy sessions. Caligula reportedly turned the imperial palace into a sort of ongoing carnival of indulgence. He staged elaborate feasts where guests were forced to drink until collapsing. He declared himself a living god, demanded worship, and is rumored to have appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a priest. The horse also allegedly had a marble stall and a house with servants. Whether or not the animal was on the Senate payroll remains a mystery, but behind these lurid stories lies an even more awkward truth. Many Roman emperors weren't the majestic, toga-draped geniuses we imagine. They were fragile, insecure men raised in an environment that prized survival over sanity. Take Emperor Nero, remembered as the fiddler who played while Rome burned. The fiddling part is a later invention, since the violin didn't exist yet. What Nero actually played was the cithara, a large stringed instrument. He loved the arts, particularly singing, and regularly forced senators and noblewomen to sit through his lengthy performances. Imagine a CEO dragging his board of directors into karaoke night and refusing to let them leave until he had finished 12 encores. That was Nero. And of course, Nero had his darker side. He's remembered for executing his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, who had been instrumental in getting him onto the throne in the first place. Their relationship was tense, to put it gently. At one point, he tried to kill her by sending her out on a boat designed to collapse and sink mid-voyage. Agrippina, being inconveniently resourceful, simply swam to shore. Nero then resorted to the less creative but more reliable method of stabbing her. Romans recorded this with the usual mixture of horror and fascination, which is how most of Nero's life was remembered. But imperial scandals weren't the only secrets of Roman life. Ordinary Romans had their own share of forbidden truths. Public baths, for example, were a central part of daily life. Everyone went to bathe, socialize, gossip, and occasionally conduct business. But while the marble statues and mosaics made it look respectable, the baths were also hubs of less polite activities. Prostitution was common, and more than a few senators were rumored to prefer sealing deals in the steam room, sometimes without togas. Inscriptions from Pompeii reveal graffiti that was, let's say, more honest than poetic. One writer scrawled, "Weep, you girls. My penis has given you up. Now it penetrates men's behinds. Good, bye, wondrous femininity." Subtle, the Romans were not. Religion also held its secrets. While the state religion focused on Jupiter, Mars, and the official pantheon, many Romans dabbled in mystery cults. These were semi-secret religious groups promising spiritual experiences and sometimes a better afterlife. The cult of Bacchus became so notorious for wild rituals involving wine, music, and possibly orgies that the Senate tried to ban it. Naturally, banning it only made it more popular. Other cults imported from Egypt and the East promised salvation through initiation ceremonies. To Roman traditionalists, these cults looked suspiciously foreign and dangerously fun. And then, of course, there were gladiators. We tend to think of gladiatorial combat as the ultimate Roman entertainment: blood, sand, and cheering crowds. But beneath the spectacle lay several truths that Romans themselves didn't exactly advertise. For one, gladiators were often sex symbols, despite being enslaved men trained for violence. Wealthy Roman women were notorious for pursuing affairs with them, much to the embarrassment of their husbands. Juvenal, the poet, mocked one senator's wife for leaving her respectable home to run off with a gladiator who, in his words, reeked of the barracks. It was the Roman equivalent of a senator's wife eloping with a professional wrestler. The games themselves weren't always the grand battles we imagine. Sometimes gladiators staged mock sea battles in flooded arenas, or fought blindfolded, or even against wild animals that had no intention of cooperating. One emperor Commodus insisted on participating in gladiatorial shows himself. Of course, he only fought rigged matches against opponents armed with wooden swords, because being stabbed was not part of his personal plan. The Senate was horrified, but the crowds loved it. Commodus believed himself to be Hercules reborn, which, considering he spent his evenings clubbing animals in the arena, was perhaps accurate in the least flattering sense. All of these stories, the scandals, the cults, the graffiti remind us that Rome, despite its marble monuments, was less a world of noble ideals and more a messy, human, and occasionally ridiculous society. Its elites schemed, its emperors indulged, its citizens gossiped, and its secrets were only forbidden until someone carved them onto a wall. And so, as we drift deeper into the night, we can leave behind Rome's gleaming facades and remember it as it really was. Not just a city of triumphs, but also of whispers, indulgences, and very awkward family dinners. Part 2. The Untold Horrors of the Victorian Era. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're leaving behind the marble columns of Rome and stepping into a world that looks strangely familiar, but with more soot. The Victorian Era, an age that loved to congratulate itself on progress, manners, and invention. And yet, if you scratched the polished surface of empire, you often found misery, filth, and an alarming number of accidents involving chimney sweeps. The Victorians were masters of presentation. They adored rules, etiquette, and a good doily. But beneath the lace and gaslight was a society that was astonishingly grim. A world where a single cough could spell disaster, where children were sent down chimneys because their arms were conveniently thin, and where dinner might contain a casual sprinkle of arsenic accidentally, of course. Let's start with the cities, since that's where most of the progress gathered. London, for example, was the pride of the empire. It was also, depending on the direction of the wind, an unbreathable soup of coal smoke, horse manure, and human waste. The Thames, that great artery of the city, functioned less like a river and more like an open sewer. By the 1850s, the stench had grown so unbearable that Parliament itself was nearly forced to evacuate. They called it the Great Stink. Imagine an entire government held hostage by its own river. They solved it eventually by constructing sewers, but only after years of holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses while pretending everything was fine. For the average person, city life meant endless work and little comfort. Families crammed into single rooms, often with multiple children, and sometimes even lodgers. Privacy was rare, and sanitation was a distant dream. Diseases spread quickly. Cholera was the most unwelcome guest, sweeping through water supplies with brutal efficiency. Doctors, of course, had no idea what caused it. Many believed foul air, miasma, was to blame, which meant that instead of cleaning the water, authorities suggested holding scented flowers near your face. Naturally, this did nothing, except perhaps make dying slightly more fragrant. Children were everywhere in Victorian society, and most of them were working. The romantic image of the angelic Victorian child, dressed in frills and curls, was largely reserved for the middle and upper classes. For everyone else, children were cheap labor. They worked in textile mills, where little fingers were considered ideal for untangling threads caught in the machinery. If those fingers were lost in the process, well, there were always more children. They also worked in coal mines, crawling through tunnels too narrow for adults. And of course, they were chimney sweeps, climbing through soot, blackened shafts, often naked to avoid getting stuck. Many died from falls, suffocation, or, in the longer term, chimney-related cancers. It's difficult to romanticize a world where childhood often ended at age 6, with a brush in hand and a lifetime of lung damage. But it wasn't just the poor who suffered. Even the wealthy Victorians, swaddled in silks and lace, found creative ways to harm themselves. Take fashion, for instance. Women's dresses often contained layers of crinoline, which were light, airy, and highly flammable. Many a society lady discovered that brushing too close to a fireplace could result in a dramatic and fatal accident. Queen Victoria herself lost one of her ladies. In waiting to such a fire, men weren't much safer. Their collars, starched to near rigidity, could cut off circulation to the carotid artery if too tight. Doctors dubbed this the father killer. Imagine dressing for dinner and risking asphyxiation from your shirt. Cosmetics were another quiet hazard. Arsenic-based powders promised a pale, fashionable complexion, while lead made an excellent whitening agent. Naturally, they slowly poisoned the wearer. Some Victorians even took arsenic pills to maintain a fresh appearance. The logic seemed to be, if you can't live long, you might at least look good for the portrait. And then there were the funerals. Victorians had a famously complicated relationship with death. They adored mourning rituals, perhaps because death was such a constant companion. A child might die of fever before their first birthday, and entire families could be wiped out by a single outbreak of influenza. In response, the Victorians built an entire culture of grief. Black mourning clothes were worn for months, even years. Queen Victoria herself wore black for 4 decades after Prince Albert died, transforming mourning into a full-time job. Photographers offered memento mori portraits, taking pictures of the deceased posed as if still alive. Families displayed these proudly, as though Uncle George had merely dozed off while sitting suspiciously stiff in his chair. Work was grim, but leisure had its horrors too. The Victorians loved amusement parks, circuses, and freak shows. Entire careers were built on exhibiting people with unusual bodies. Whether due to medical conditions or cultural difference, crowds gathered to gawk at the bearded lady, the giant, or people imported from colonies and displayed as curiosities. It was both entertainment and a not-so-subtle reminder of empire, with all the awkwardness that entails. Speaking of empire, Britain's global reach provided both wealth and tragedy. Colonial ventures enriched the metropole, but at staggering human cost. India, in particular, saw devastating famines during the Victorian period, often exacerbated by British economic policies. Grain was exported while millions starved, because the empire believed in maintaining markets, even at the expense of lives. Back home, most Victorians preferred not to notice, focusing instead on their afternoon tea, which ironically came from those very colonies. And then there was medicine. If you were unwell, the remedies could be as dangerous as the disease. Opium-based syrups, such as Godfrey's cordial, were routinely given to infants to keep them quiet. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was popular among adults for everything from headaches to existential dread. Writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Elizabeth Barrett Browning became dependent on it. For a society obsessed with discipline and morality, the Victorians were quietly awash in narcotics. Surgery was another ordeal. Before anesthesia, operations were performed with speed as the only mercy. Amputations were timed with stopwatches, and surgeons prided themselves on how quickly they could saw through a limb. Even after anesthesia was introduced, hygiene lagged behind. Many surgeons scoffed at the idea of washing their hands, considering it beneath their dignity. As a result, hospitals were less places of healing and more convenient waiting rooms for death. If you survived long enough, you might still fall victim to one of the many accidental hazards of Victorian life. Gaslighting, for instance, illuminated homes beautifully while quietly filling them with toxic fumes. Wallpaper dyed with arsenic released lethal dust particles into the air, which means that even sitting in a fashionable parlor could be a health risk. Some speculate that Napoleon's death was hastened by exposure to arsenic, clad in wallpaper during his exile, though his fashion sense, at least, remained on trend. And yet, despite the misery, the Victorians managed to convince themselves, and posterity, that theirs was a golden age of refinement. Perhaps that's the most horrifying detail of all. They believed it. They wrote manuals on etiquette, describing the correct angle for a bow or the proper way to refuse an invitation, all while ignoring the fact that half the city was coughing itself to death outside their parlor windows. So when we think of the Victorian era, its lace curtains, its gas lamps, its endless novels, we should also remember its arsenic dresses, its soot, choked children, and its suspiciously quiet babies, lulled into silence with opium. It was, in short, an age that perfected the art of looking respectable while living in a state of constant peril. As we drift onward, let's leave behind the gaslit streets and mourning veils and turn toward the next chapter of royal dysfunction. Because the Victorians may have excelled at misery, but Europe's monarchs were never far behind in providing scandals of their own. Part 3. Secrets the Church tried to bury in the Middle Ages. Hey everyone! Tonight we're leaving behind the smog and stiff collars of the Victorians and stepping into the candlelit silence of medieval Europe. Or rather, the supposed silence. The Church loved to present itself as timeless, solemn, and unchanging, a spiritual rock in a world of war, famine, and questionable hygiene. But beneath the incense, smoke, and stained glass, there were secrets, scandals, and a few cover-ups that would make even the most wayward royal look organized. The medieval church was vast, powerful, and very concerned with appearances. Priests preached poverty while wearing jeweled robes. Monks copied holy texts while occasionally doodling little rabbits stabbing knights in the margins. And popes, well, the popes were in a league of their own. Supposedly shepherds of souls, they spent much of their energy quarreling with kings, collecting taxes, and, naturally, fighting each other for the job. Take, for instance, the papal election of 1378. Things got so heated that the Church ended up with not one pope, but two. Each declared the other illegitimate. For a while, half of Europe followed one pope, and half followed the other, creating what was politely called the Western Schism. Eventually, to resolve this, the cardinals decided to elect a third pope, because of course they did. The result was 3 rival popes, each excommunicating the other 2, while ordinary Christians simply tried to keep track of which pope's name to mumble during Mass. The solution took nearly 40 years, but papal politics were only part of the secretive world the Church tried to manage. Let's drift toward monastic life. On paper, monasteries were bastions of prayer, learning, and pious simplicity. In practice, they were sometimes more like well-fortified wine clubs. Monks produced beer, wine, and cheese, delicious, yes, but not always in the spirit of fasting and self-denial. Monastic rules forbade eating meat, but conveniently reclassified beavers, puffins, and other semi-aquatic animals as fish, which meant, of course, that you could enjoy roast beaver tail on a Friday with a clear conscience. And then there were the financial matters. Monasteries became major landowners, amassing wealth while preaching the virtues of poverty. Some abbots lived in such luxury that they resembled minor princes. The Benedictine rule emphasized moderation, but moderation often included feasts of roasted swans, generous wine cellars, and enough servants to keep the cloister spotless. When critics pointed this out, the monks simply replied that spiritual poverty was different from material poverty, which is one way of saying, we're poor in spirit, but we'll take another goblet of wine, thank you. Of course, not every secret was so cheerful. One of the more troubling realities was clerical celibacy. Officially, priests and monks were forbidden to marry or keep mistresses. In reality, many did both. Local bishops often turned a blind eye, so long as the priest paid the necessary fines. Entire towns knew which priest had children, and often those children grew up to become priests themselves. By the 12th century, this became such a widespread issue that the Church launched reform movements, repeatedly declaring celibacy mandatory. Each time, priests nodded politely, then went back to their unofficial households. The scandal wasn't so much that priests broke the rules, but that everyone pretended not to notice. Then there were the relics. Medieval Christians adored relics, the bones of saints, scraps of clothing, or anything that might have brushed against holiness. In principle, relics were meant to inspire devotion. In practice, they inspired a lively market economy. By the 13th century, Europe was positively overflowing with holy objects. Churches claimed to possess multiple heads of John the Baptist, enough fragments of the true cross to build a small ship, and at one point what was advertised as the holy foreskin. Pilgrims flocked to see these treasures, often paying fees for the privilege, which meant relics were both spiritually uplifting and financially rewarding. The church quietly tolerated the duplications because it kept pilgrims moving and coins flowing. And while relics multiplied, so did forbidden texts. The church carefully guarded what could and could not be read. Certain gospels known as apocryphal were excluded from the Bible. They contained stories too strange or inconvenient, like Jesus as a mischievous child striking other children dead, then reviving them out of guilt. These stories survived in hidden manuscripts, while the official church assured everyone that the canonical Gospels were the only acceptable versions. To the medieval faithful, the missing stories were simply lost. To modern historians, they are reminders of just how curated the past was. But perhaps the most striking secrets the church tried to bury involved women. The medieval church liked to describe itself as a spiritual mother, but actual women often found themselves sidelined or silenced. Female mystics and visionaries sometimes broke through, claiming visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary. Their writings could be ecstatic, poetic, and unsettling. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, described vivid visions of cosmic light and divine fire. She was admired, but also carefully monitored. Many other women mystics were dismissed as hysterical or heretical. And speaking of heresy, that was the church's greatest fear. The medieval world was filled with small movements of Christians who dared to interpret the Bible differently. The Cathars in southern France, for instance, believed the material world was corrupt and rejected the authority of the Catholic hierarchy. Naturally, the church responded with a crusade. Entire towns were massacred in the Albigensian crusade, and the Cathars were wiped out. Officially, this was portrayed as holy war. Unofficially, it was also about stamping out a rival version of Christianity that was growing inconveniently popular. To keep future heresies in check, the church developed the Inquisition. The image of dark dungeons and torture chambers belongs more to later propaganda. But inquisitors did investigate, interrogate, and occasionally burn people at the stake. The goal wasn't always execution. It was often confession and reintegration. But the spectacle of punishment ensured that others thought twice before straying too far from orthodoxy. The church kept meticulous records, but also carefully curated what was remembered. Failures, excesses, and contradictions were quietly filed away, leaving only the polished image of steady authority. Yet despite all the secrecy, cracks still showed. In the 14th century, when the Black Death swept across Europe, people turned desperately to the church for answers. The clergy offered prayers, processions, and sometimes blamed Jews or other minorities for poisoning wells. The plague killed priests as easily as peasants, which made the church's reassurances ring hollow. Afterward, confidence in church authority was shaken. Mystical movements, doomsday prophets, and reformers multiplied. Many of their writings were suppressed, but some slipped through, revealing a world where faith and doubt lived uncomfortably side by side. Even popes themselves weren't immune to scandal. Pope Alexander VI, of the notorious Borgia family, openly acknowledged his children despite that whole vow of celibacy thing. He arranged lucrative marriages for them, threw opulent banquets, and conducted papal business with the flair of a crime boss. Everyone knew, Everyone gossiped, and yet the church's official records worked hard to present the papacy as an unbroken line of holy shepherds. The dissonance was remarkable. So what do we make of all this? The medieval church wasn't simply a monolith of piety. It was a human institution, with all the frailty, ambition, and hypocrisy that comes with being human. Its secrets were less about hidden treasure chests, and more about the ordinary messiness it tried to keep behind the altar screen. Priests with families, popes with mistresses, monks with wine cellars, relics multiplied beyond reason, all of it quietly managed, quietly denied, quietly forgotten. And perhaps that's the most telling secret of all. The church didn't need to bury every truth. Time and silence did the work for them. People forgot, records were lost, stories faded, and all that remained was the solemn facade of stained glass and Gregorian chant. But if you look closely, you can still see the outlines of what lay beneath. So, as we drift onward, let's leave the cloisters and candle smoke behind. The Middle Ages had no shortage of secrets, but royals, as always, managed to provide their own brand of dysfunction. Which means our next stop is another round of dynastic oddities and royal meltdowns, because no matter how much the church tried to curate reality, kings and queens were often busy proving that truth really is stranger than anything written in a sermon. Part 4. The Dark Side of the Age of Discovery. Hey everyone. Tonight we're leaving behind the medieval cloisters and drifting out onto the wide, creaking decks of wooden ships. The Age of Discovery, that golden age when Europe supposedly found the rest of the world, as if entire continents had simply been misplaced under the couch. It's usually told as a story of daring captains, brave sailors, and glorious discoveries. Maps expanding, horizons widening. But beneath the romance of sea spray and star charts was a much less comfortable truth. The Age of Discovery had a dark underbelly, and naturally, it was kept politely out of the bedtime stories. The explorers themselves were not always the noble, visionary men their statues suggest. Many were, frankly, exhausted second sons of minor nobility. They had little chance of inheriting land, and few talents beyond holding a sword and signing their name badly. Exploration was a convenient career path. You could gamble everything on the hope of spices, gold, or some vague new territory. And if you failed, well, you'd probably be lost at sea, and nobody back home would notice too much. Let's start with Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, as he was actually called. We like to imagine him as a brilliant navigator, boldly proving the earth was round. In reality, most educated Europeans already knew the earth was round. Columbus's real talent was stubbornness. He underestimated the size of the globe, convinced himself Asia was just a short sail west, and spent years pestering monarchs to fund his plan. The Portuguese told him no. The English said no. Eventually, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, exhausted from their own wars and looking for a quick economic fix, said yes. When Columbus finally sailed west, he did not find Asia. He found islands full of people who had been living there for thousands of years. Columbus promptly declared them subjects of Spain. He was not above kidnapping, enslaving, or punishing the islanders for failing to provide enough gold. His governorship was so brutal that even the Spanish crown eventually arrested him. And yet, centuries later, he still ended up with a national holiday in his honor. History, as always, has a short memory when it comes to unpleasant details. Columbus, of course, was only the beginning. Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to India, a feat that looked heroic on a map, but left behind a trail of burned towns and terrified merchants. His expedition was less about meeting new people, and more about showing them European cannons and demanding trade privileges. When the locals hesitated, da Gama bombarded the coast until they reconsidered. It was international diplomacy, 16th century style. Then there was Ferdinand Magellan. He's remembered as the man who circumnavigated the globe. Except he didn't. Magellan was killed in the Philippines after underestimating a local chief, and only a fraction of his original crew staggered home years later. They were starving, riddled with scurvy, and too thin to lift their swords. But they had technically made it around the world, so Magellan got the credit. History often rewards the idea of an explorer, even when the man himself ended up dead in a ditch halfway through. The darker side of exploration wasn't just about individual behavior. It was systemic. Discovery was almost always followed by conquest. Islands were claimed, with flags and solemn prayers, as though the people already living there were invisible. The age-old habit of Europeans declaring ownership of things they had just laid eyes on reached new heights. If there was a tree, they named it. A river, they renamed it. An entire empire, they called it New. New Spain, New France, New England. No word on whether the original inhabitants found this refreshing. And then, of course, came the Columbian Exchange. That cheerful phrase describes the movement of plants, animals, and diseases between the old and new worlds. Europe gained potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate. The Americas gained smallpox, measles, and influenza. The impact was catastrophic. Entire populations collapsed, villages emptied overnight. For the Europeans, it was framed as divine providence. For the people who died, it was just tragedy. Even the so-called scientific achievements of the Age of Discovery were laced with irony. Explorers returned with exotic specimens, pineapples, parrots, armadillos, while often misunderstanding them completely. One early European sketch of a manatee labeled it as a mermaid, which says less about the beauty of the manatee and more about how long sailors had been at sea without company. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of this period was the birth of the transatlantic slave trade. Portugal and Spain, and later England, France, and the Netherlands, all embraced the idea of transporting millions of Africans across the ocean to labor in colonies. Ships were crowded, disease-ridden, and deadly. Mortality rates were so high that traders factored death into their business models. The Age of Discovery was not just about spices and silk. It was also about sugar, tobacco, and human lives reduced to cargo. The Church, of course, had opinions about all this. Officially, the Pope divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas. It was an elegant solution, if you ignored the fact that nobody consulted the people actually living in those territories. Spiritually, the Church insisted that exploration was about spreading Christianity. In practice, missionaries often arrived after soldiers, standing beside burning villages with crosses in hand. Conversion was not always voluntary, but the records, when carefully written, made it sound as though the whole world had been politely waiting for baptism. And while all this unfolded abroad, Europe itself was undergoing its own quiet problems. Explorers returned with exotic luxuries, but the wealth rarely trickled down. Sailors who survived the voyages often came home with nothing more than scurvy scars and half a paycheck. Merchants and monarchs grew rich, dynasties expanded their power, and peasants, as always, kept farming turnips. For them, the Age of Discovery was mostly irrelevant, except that taxes mysteriously went up to fund another ship heading into the unknown. There's also the curious matter of maps. Before the great discoveries, European maps were cheerfully inaccurate. Seas full of monsters, islands that didn't exist, entire kingdoms drawn from rumor. Exploration should have clarified things. And it did, but it also created new layers of myth. Cartographers filled blank spaces with notes like "Here be dragons," which was a polite way of saying, we have absolutely no idea what's over there. Even after circumnavigation, much of the world remained more imagination than reality. And then there were the explorers' personal habits. Sailors lived in close quarters, with food that was barely edible. Ships reeked of sweat, bilge water, and rotting meat. Rats and lice thrived. Scurvy turned gums black and made teeth fall out. And yet, journals written by officers often skimmed over these details, preferring to talk about sunsets and exotic birds. The myth of heroic discovery was carefully preserved, while the realities of dysentery were gently brushed aside. Still, despite the darkness, there's something hypnotic about the whole era. The sheer audacity of setting sail into the unknown with no GPS, no weather forecast, and only a vague hope of land. The explorers may have been greedy, violent, or tragically misguided, but they were also, in their way, dreamers. Dreamers who sailed west and returned east, who mapped oceans and toppled empires, who reshaped the world in ways both wondrous and terrible. So, the Age of Discovery wasn't just an age of discovery. It was an age of erasure, conquest, and exploitation. An age when one continent's new beginning was another's catastrophe, and an age when the secrets, failures, and moral messiness were conveniently buried beneath tales of glory. Let's drift onward now, leaving the creak of masts and the crash of waves behind. Our next stop will bring us back to the palaces and private chambers of Europe, because while explorers were busy claiming continents, monarchs were still busy being themselves petty, inbred, and occasionally disastrous. And, as always, they did it in the most sleep-inducing fashion possible. And so, we drift to the end of our journey tonight, from the forbidden corridors of Rome to the grim streets of the Victorian Age, through the hushed secrets of the medieval church, and across the oceans of discovery that were not always as glorious as we were told. History, when you strip away the polished tales, is a collection of people stumbling through life, making strange choices, and leaving us stories that are half comedy, half tragedy. If you're still awake, well done. But if you've already drifted off somewhere along the way, then perhaps that's the real success of these long, quiet wanderings. Thank you for spending your night here with me. Sleep well, dream softly, and we'll meet again soon, somewhere else in the past. Asterisk.